this, but somebody at the time in Holland was a depression, and people advised him not to open up a business in Holland because it wasn't going to make it, because business was so bad. They said, why don't you move to England? And they had just had a baby. That was my oldest aunt, my mother's oldest sister. And they picked themselves up and moved to London, to the East End, which was more or less a Jewish area of London. And he opened up a business there and had the other 5 children, of what my mother was number 2, and she was born in London. So the other children were all born in London, in England. And I have to say, once, I don't know how the laws are today, but in the day, it was that if you were born in England, you were always a British citizen. So they had business there. The kids went to school there. And then around, my mother was born in 1907. So when she was 16, which was 1923, in those days, they missed their family in Holland. They had parents and family, aunts and uncles, and things were getting better in Holland, so the whole family moved back to Amsterdam. And he ended up opening up 2 stores and a warehouse. And it's a business that doesn't exist here at all. I don't think it exists anywhere in the world anymore. It has shoemaker supplies and nails. You could make shoes from bottom up, and also shoemakers that had soccer supplies, luggage. I mean, and it wasn't a department store, but that's what it was. Even stuff for the policemen to wear on the motorcycles. But anyway, they did quite well, and most of the children of my grandfather worked in the store. He was quite a taskmaster, and he made his daughters work like men. They had to do the cleaning and do the buying and do the selling, and my mother was quite smart in the business. And so her older sister met a gentleman and got married, and the gentleman had a twin brother. And the twin brother fell in love with my mother fell in love with him. So there's 2 sisters married to 2 brothers, and I'm the product of that marriage. Anyway, life was beautiful. We had lovely families on both sides. On my mother's side, I was the oldest grandchild. On my father's side, for the longest time, I was the youngest grandchild. And everything was beautiful, and we had parties, and I'm going to switch to some, before I go on, I want to show you, we went to a camp called Westerbork, because I might not be able to get back to the map, and this is Vitel, where we ended up. But anyway, so this is my oldest aunt on the right, my mother, and that is me in the buggy. And I have no idea how these pictures survived the war, by the way. And my mother was the only one who had children. Anyway, I went to a little school. My mother worked, so I went to daycare, and it was a Jewish daycare. And we had parties and visits together, and everything was beautiful until I was 4 years old, and it was 1940. And the Germans on May 10th, 1940, invaded the Netherlands. Now, before that, in Germany, in 1938 was Kristallnacht, which is, the commemoration is coming up next week on November 9th. So, since Holland was neutral in World War I, the German Jews thought, they were trying to flee the country because they saw bad things happening, and they came to Holland because they thought Holland was neutral. But as I told you a few seconds ago, that Holland was a very small country. It's very, there were a lot of farms and stuff like that. There were of course, no high rises, and there weren't too many places to live. So the Dutch government allowed these people to come in, but they told the Jews that the Dutch Jews, that they had to provide for these people. So they found an area in Westerbork, in that area of the country that was very desolate and sandy and nothing much was growing there. And they said that they would build cabins for these people, and and the Jews had to pay for it, the Dutch Jews. And these German immigrants or refugees built their lives there. You know, they made like a town. You know, they had schools, they had theater. You know, they did the best they could, and they had food. And of course, they were free to come and go. There was no barbed wire or anything there. So, although like, you know, Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, came to the Netherlands with money, so he didn't have to go to Westerbork because he had enough money to buy property and run a business, and there were more people like that. And I'm not being critical, but it's just factual. Anyway, so 1940, the Germans attacked the Netherlands. It only took them not more than a day to defeat the Dutch army, which was an army in name only, because I don't think they'd fought a war ever, and are not in recent years. And they burnt the city of Rotterdam, which is south of Amsterdam, which was the big harbor. Rotterdam also had the building where all the papers were kept of foreign people living in the Netherlands. And I don't know, I do remember the Germans invading Amsterdam, and we had to put our shades down. We weren't allowed to look out, and I heard you could hear the marching down, but people did peek out, you know, and we saw them come by. Now, the Dutch government had fled the country, including the royal household. So now the country is left to the police to run the country, and the Germans, who now occupy us. And before long, rules are being instituted against the Jews, because just aside, World War II was really two wars. It was a war to conquer land, and it was a war to make Hitler's idea was to make this country free of people such as Jews or mentally disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay and lesbians, people that were incapacitated in any which way. So that was the other war. And so he started against the Jews, and they started to give rules. Now these rules they didn't give the rules themselves, you know, they did it through the Dutch police. And there were always new rules coming up. They didn't come up every day, but frequent enough. And the rules, to summarize them, were that Jews had a curfew. Jews were not allowed in parks. People weren't allowed to go to movies. You weren't allowed to you have to hand in all your valuables, gold, silver, diamonds, whatever you had, no radios. Now, in other words, they left you with nothing. You know, you just had to more or less stay home. And we also had to wear a Jewish star. And I don't know if you've ever seen a Jewish star. There is one in here. This one. And the ironic part is that it was printed on sheets of this gold material. And I have a paper at home that tells you that you have to, they also started, one of the rules was that you had ration coupons so that you could only buy a certain amount of food at a certain day. So this was a textile coupon. You had to give, even though it was their rule, they made us hand in a textile coupon. You had to cut it around, and you had to sew it on. And it had to be sewn right here on your left chest, and it had to be sewn solidly. And of course, we stuck out very much by wearing the star. They knew a Jew when they saw one. And you also had a Jewish identity paper, which had a big J on it. So the Germans could stop you at any time and ask for your identity paper, and you better have it on you. And you better wear the star. And so in 1940, 41, we also had no we had no more radios. We have, of course, the papers. Jews weren't allowed to get the paper. There were very few people had telephones, and of course, cell phones or internet was not in existence. We had a telephone in our business because we had a business and you had to have a telephone. So when you saw each other down in Holland, when the families met, you didn't call up and say, okay, let's go to the movies. You would see them on the street and you would say, oh, come over Sunday, we're having a party, or come over for dinner or for coffee or forever. And starts the end of 41, 42, all of a sudden, we don't see family anymore, especially on my father's side. And they started to disappear, and then you started to hear that there were camps. So what the Germans did, since they had this prepared camp with the German Jews there, they started to make them bigger and make barracks and have people build barracks. And that's where they deported the Jews, the Dutch Jews to, which was in Westerbork. And so people start, you start to worry, very much so. You have to remember, you start to think, what's going on here? You don't know whether you're safe, you're not safe, you don't know if somebody rings the doorbell, if you're being arrested, you just don't know. And so in the end of September, beginning of October 1942, I was 6 years old, and my parents had come home from work and put me to sleep, and they were just sitting, maybe reading or listening to the radio. They didn't have a radio anymore, so they were reading. And there's a big banging on the door, and the Germans were big on banging and screaming. And my mother opens the door, and they're yelling, "Draus, Draus, you gotta come." My mother says, I'm in Dutch, she says, "I'm sorry, but my baby's sleeping. Could you come back tomorrow?" Which they thought was the funniest thing they ever heard. And they said, "No, you gotta go now." So she got me out of bed, got me dressed. They still had their work clothes on. She took her handbag, and they had a truck, an army truck, waiting outside, and we got on this truck. And there were other people in there. And the truck took us to the central station, which wasn't far because we lived in the old part of Amsterdam. And the station wasn't far. Took us to the station, threw us on the train with other people, and we went to a town called Hooghallen, which was near Westerbork, because the train tracks in those days, in 42, did not extend to Westerbork yet. So we had to get off in the middle of the night and walk for about 5-6 kilometers and into the camp. And it was dark and rainy. It always rains in Holland, so at least it used to. And we're walking, and then they registered us in, and they separated my dad from my mom and I. And we're sitting there, waiting. They weren't working yet. They didn't have the people working at that time. And the German Jews were running the camp also. So in the meantime, so after a few days, my parents we got called up to come. They kept roll call every day, but we got called up to come to the Appellplatz, is where they kept the roll call. And there's those long tables, and all these German officers are sitting behind these tables with lists. They did have a railroad track in the camp, but it just didn't extend from the town outside into the camp. The track went out of the camp. And my mother looks, and she sees one of the officers, the Nazi officers, a young man, and she recognized him. She recognized him because he was a friend of my uncle, her brother, who was young. In those days, my aunts and uncles were young. And he used to hang out at my grandmother's house. He used to eat there. But his father was Dutch and his mother was German, and he decided to go the German way because he thought it would help him in his life. And he saw my mom, and of course he recognized her too, and he gave her a high sign with his eyes, not to show recognition. And when it came our time for the list, he took our names off the list. That's one of the reasons I am standing here. Because if he would have gone through, those trains that were waiting on the railroad were going to Auschwitz. And we would have not survived this, of course. And then we really didn't realize how fortunate we were, because the German regime governed under a lot of deceit, and they didn't know, they didn't tell you. They thought just told people that those camps were labor camps. Nobody knew that there were gas chambers, crematoria. People didn't know, and of course you had no communication to even know that those things were going on. So in the meantime, in Amsterdam, my uncle, who was the friend of the Nazi, but this has nothing, at the time he wasn't a Nazi when he was his friend, he met a woman walking down the street, and she was a secretary to a lawyer. And she said, Phil, his name was Phil, she said, there is a guy in Amsterdam who is in cahoots with the Germans, and if you have money, you can get a paper that would stop you from being sent to Auschwitz. Not, again, we didn't know Auschwitz, how bad it was, but who wanted to go away, So he said, wow, he says, how much money? And she said 120,000 guilders per person, which is like $120,000. And in 1940, I mean, it's real money now, but it was real money then. And he says, well, I have to ask my dad. But you see, my grandfather I told you he was a smart man. He was in the leather business, and the tanneries were in the southern part of Holland. And he had not given all his money to the Germans and all his diamonds. He had given it to the non-Jewish friends that he had in the south of Holland, the tannery owners, and they were keeping it for him. He said, keep this for me till I come back, because nobody expected to die or get killed, and they did. So my uncle presented this to my grandfather, and he said, well, I have to get the money back from these guys. So somehow or other, they got the money back into Amsterdam, and he paid for 11 people 120,000 guilders each to get a paper. And I'll show you the paper, and I don't know if you can see what it says. Okay, this is the paper. This is another thing that saved our lives. And I would just want you to point out that this is my maiden name, and it says D.U. Din. It doesn't say Miss or Mrs. We were identified as Jews, not as people. Okay? And it said in German on the bottom, after the address, it says that for Laufisch means for time being is free of being evacuated. So for the time being, it doesn't give you a security that you're gonna be there, that this is forever. So by the time we had come back from Westerbork, my mom, dad, and I, my grandfather was already working on this. And we still had the stores. This is in 1942. And then the Germans took over the stores, and they put German soldiers in the Jewish businesses because they were taking them over, and they're called Verwalters. And they were taking them over, but needless to say, he didn't know a thing about the business, and he also had to fight the war. So he had to go back to the front, and they had, in Holland, they developed a Nazi party. Dutch people were in the Nazi party called the NSB, and one of the Nazi party guys worked in the store, and he was taking the place of the German soldier who then had to go back to the front. He knew less than the other guy knew, so they kept my mother in the store because she seemed to be bossy. And so she was there, and as they still had merchandise because it wasn't easy to get merchandise, and when she rang up the register, she didn't put everything in register, which is not a very nice thing to do. But if you have to live, you have to live. You have to do things sometimes that are not totally honest. So she put some of the money in because the family had to eat. And the coupons, the rations weren't enough. And because of that, developed what they call a black market. So the farmers from all around, we're a lot of dairy. Holland is a dairy country. And they would come with butter and eggs, but you had to pay dearly for that. And this is the money that paid for that. So then, in 1943, in the summer, the German had come back from the front. He decided they knew it all. They could handle the business, so he had them pick us all up. It was my mom, dad, my grandparents, and I. And we were sent to a place called the Hollandse Schouwburg, which was a theater in Amsterdam. And they had made it into a holding place. They took all the seats out, a holding place before you get deported to Westerbork. And again, this paper saved us. And now this is 43, I was 7 years old, and I still remember as we walked out, the German yelling, 1, 2, 3, Schweinhund. Schweinhund is pig. They referred to us as pigs. But we didn't care. We wanted to be out, And also, I have to interject that I did not have education all this time either, because the schools were closed. Anyway, we went back home, and then most of the Dutch Jews were located in Amsterdam, the majority of the population. And there was a population of 140,000 Jews when the war broke out. And I just want you to know at this point that 75% of the 140,000 were killed, murdered, did not come back. So anyway, they had all the other Jews and the other towns in Holland, they moved them all to Amsterdam because the Germans were very organized. So they wanted them all, and they formed like a ghetto. We had to get out of our house, and they took one area in the east side of Amsterdam that were empty apartments of people that already had been deported, and they took them and put us in that area. And September 29th, 1943, was the last big raid out of Amsterdam. They were clearing us out, and they told us to all come to the station. By then, they were so organized that they sent you a letter telling you what to bring. A big backpack, and towels, and a blanket, and a pillow, and blah, blah, blah. So they did that, and we're all standing there, and we didn't know who was there and who wasn't there, but we had a family whistle. And my father was whistling, and then he got whistles back, so we knew other parts of our family were there. And we all ended up back in Westerbork. We were all checked in again and deloused, and they put you through DDT and all that stuff. And then we were all assigned to a barrack. And the barracks had, you might call them beds. They were aluminum structures that were like aluminum here, and then 1, 2, 3 stories. There were no beds. They were more like, it was all straw mattresses. We were about maybe 1/4 of an inch thick. And that's where we were. And then we started getting lice, and there was only one. The women were separated again from the men. We started to get, and the women had to work, and the men had to work. So my aunts and my mother and my grandmother had to work in the kitchen peeling potatoes and carrots, because that's all we got to eat was so-called water soup and bread that was made out of sawdust and stuff like that. But we weren't beaten, or, the only time you took your life in your hands, rather, is if you decided to escape, because then they had the watchtowers and they would kill you. But in the meantime, once a week, on Tuesday, they would come, and the lights had to be out at a certain time. They would turn on the lights, and they would come in the barracks, and they would call the names, and those were the names of the people that were being sent to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. And I can still hear the screams in my head because people, as I said again, they didn't know that they were going to be killed, but they knew they were going somewhere else, and it wasn't a wonderful place to go. And in the meantime, you're in fear. You know, I wasn't because I was a child, but I can imagine my parents, my grandparents, and all the other adults. You don't know what's going on. As a matter of fact, once you were in the camp, you felt a little bit easier because you didn't have to wait for the Germans to come to your door to pick you up and arrest you. You were here, okay? So, going back to my part that I told you that my family was born in England, my one aunt, the one that was born right after my mother, had her passport, her English passport, and she had taken it to the consulate in England, in Amsterdam, and they told her that they couldn't do anything about it, although it wasn't expiring until 1945. But the woman at the consulate said, you know, don't destroy it, keep it with you, and you never know, it might come in handy. So she stuck it, when she was arrested, she and her husband, she stuck it in her girdle. A girdle is a Spanx, what you call Spanx nowadays, because she didn't want it to be stolen and she didn't want to lose it. And, you know, so when she got there, there was a woman who was in charge of Westerbork, a German, and she would come every so often and hear stories of people to see what she could do, or, you know, she wasn't going to do anything good, but she just was there to be she was not the commandant, she was she was whatever she was. Anyway, my aunt got an appointment with her, and the woman didn't speak Dutch, my aunt didn't speak German, so there was a woman who translated for her. Now, this particular woman was a German Jewish woman who had benefited when my grandfather when all these people came to Holland, he had given them merchandise and money so they could live because he was very philanthropic. He wanted to help these people. He said, you know, he can't let people starve to death. So she was translating, I guess she was translating the right thing. And they said, so the woman said, well, in that case, if you're British, you're going to Vitel. Okay? So that was in France. But we didn't know where it was. You know, we had never heard of it. You might have heard of Vitel Water. It was a spa and it had hotels because it was a spa. But the Germans had taken it as a camp because it had a lot of rooms. So my aunt says, well, what about my husband? They said, your husband is Dutch. She says, no, he's not Dutch. He's stateless. You know, he was in, but his papers got burned in Rotterdam because Rotterdam was burned at the onset of the war. And she said, okay. And then she came back to the barracks and she told my mom and dad and my other aunt and uncle and my grandparents, and they all went in to talk to her. And through just sheer luck, we all got sent to Vitel. And my oldest aunt, who was married to my father's twin brother, who was not born in Holland, was afraid that she would ruin it for the rest of the family. She says, I'm not going to lie. And she was sent to Bergen-Belsen, where her husband was killed. She survived. Anyway, I have the paper, here that shows you. Okay, this is an Enlassungsschein. That means it shows that me, again, the Jew. This was the liberation. That was when we left Westerbork in 42. Okay, here, this shows that this was to my father. It said that you and your family will go to Vitel on Thursday, the 3rd of September. In Europe, the dates are reversed. That you would go. So we all went to Vitel, and it was hotels there, but they weren't hotels, they were just buildings, they weren't run as hotels. And what it turned out to be is that we were hostages. In other words, the Germans were sure that they were going to win the war and that they were going to trade us as hostages. And there were people there from all over the world. There were Polish people, not only Jewish people. There were political prisoners from England and people from all over. There were from every country, Belgians and whatever. And that's where we were. Now remember, all this time, I had no education, but I had learned to read when I was 4 years old. And that was another story. I'd broken my arm, and some lady took me in, helped my mother, and she taught me to read, which was a wonderful thing because otherwise I would have really had not made it. And so in Vital, it wasn't really, it was bad. We were in prison. We were under German command. There was barbed wire. But again, we were not bodily harmed. And we were hearing rumors about Franklin Roosevelt. We heard about Normandy. And my grandfather said, I think my son is in the Normandy. I don't know how he got the idea, just because one of my uncles, my mother had two brothers, one of them had fled Holland and had left, he left home, and he eventually ended up in the Dutch Royal Air Force, where he became a captain in the Royal Air Force, and indeed he was flying over Normandy. But my grandfather just had an intuition, okay? And at one time, on a day, the Germans, this is 1944 now, my aunt, I have still one aunt, my mother's youngest sister, who's 97 years old, and she tells me that there was a man walking around the camp, on the outside, an old man, and they couldn't figure out why this old man was walking outside the camp. So the camp was, there was a main street in between, and there was camp here, and it was camp there, and barbed wire. So the main street was used by the residents of Vitel. It was free country. We were not free. And one day, they hear shooting and shooting, and it's the French underground, the French resistance, the Maquis, were trying to liberate us. And this old man was not an old man at all. He was a young soldier disguised as an old man, and he was casing the joint, he was checking out how the layout of the camp. Unfortunately, the Maquis was not strong enough to defend, but they did shoot the commandant, the head of the camp. And now they electrified the barbed wire so we couldn't get out anyway, but where were we going to go? And in September of 44, we were liberated by the wonderful American Army. What a wonderful sight they were. And it was unbelievable. And they liberated us. Now comes the next phase. We're liberated. We're free. Free to do what? Free to go where? We had nothing. We had no money, no clothes, no nothing. So the American Army needed this Vital. They wanted to use it themselves for whatever, for the soldiers or whatever. And they moved us further down south to a place called La Bourboule. And they, see it says La Bourboule on their Displaced Persons Center. And that was, and I was in Vitel from March 11th, and was liberated on October 25th, 44. So that's 7 months, Anyway, so they sent us to La Bourboule, and La Bourboule also happens to be a spa. It's still there. And they put us again in hotels because, these little towns in these countries don't have high rises and stuff like that. It's not like the States. And we got food from the Red Cross, and we had no place to go because we couldn't go back to Holland. We were free to go back to Holland, but Holland was still occupied. Holland wasn't liberated till May 4th of 1945. And can you imagine a country smaller than the state of Rhode Island had to be liberated by 3 different armies, like the Canadian, the British, and the American Army. And there were some bloody, bloody battles. The Battle of Arnhem, you can Google it once. It was quite bloody. Anyway, so we had to stay there. And somehow my mother made acquaintance with the principal of the grammar school in La Bourboule, and she took a liking to my mom, and she said, give me your daughter and we'll put her in school. She spoke some English. So I went to school there. I was still very young, and I learned to speak French, and I still have my notebooks at home from those days, where I learned to write and to do some math and stuff. And she loved my mother, and she invited my mother and I over and made tea and cake. It was like we had gone to heaven, because we hadn't had tea or cake. I didn't even know what cake was. I mean, it was, she was a fabulous lady. Anyway, we stayed there, and then when Holland was liberated, we got permission, my mother got permission to go to Paris to talk to the Dutch consul and get papers organized for the whole family, because my aunts and uncles, the ones that went to Vitel, and my grandparents were there. And we were able to go back to Holland. Now it's June of 1945. They put us on a train, had no windows, everything was shot out and destroyed. And we get on the train, and we had to make a stop near Paris, and it was Passover at the time, which is a Jewish holiday, and but we didn't have matzah, we couldn't observe it. And anyway, we come back to Holland, and the Dutch officials are waiting for us at the station, the same station we left from in 1942. And they put a lariat on us, and with a sign with a big D on it. And D meant dakloos, which means you have no roof, homeless, which is very hurtful when you come back after so many years not having your own home, and then you come back to your native country and they call you homeless. And they gave everybody 10 guilders. There were no euros in those days. And they gave us 10 guilders, which didn't do very much. But in their defense, I have to say the Dutch had a hard time in the winter, the hunger winter and stuff. They were eating tulip bulbs and stuff, and there was nothing. The country was bombed. So they had a hard time of it, but at the time we didn't think that way. And we were very fortunate that friends of ours in Amsterdam, who were not Jewish, heard about the fact that we were at the station, and they came to get us because they were putting everybody in orphanages. The Germans had emptied the orphanages, the Jewish orphanages, or any orphanages, because those were not the people that were deemed important. And but they took us into their house, and of course my mother gave them her 10 guilders. And then they went to look in the streets, and they found that our store was still there. But the Dutch Nazi was still there. And by this time, my father had found out that his whole family, all his sisters and brothers, all his nieces, all my cousins who were married, there must have been like 80-some people, had not returned, had been killed. He and I were the only one left with that last name. And he was besides himself, and he almost killed that Nazi. But, and he threw him out of the store, but the police wasn't very active at that time, so they didn't care what you did. And we went back in the store, and it was my grandfather's building, and they moved back in. Of course, there was no merchandise because it was post-war, there was nothing. And my mom and dad and I got assigned an apartment that belonged to a Nazi who had now been imprisoned. And in the attic were all these I still remember all that Nazi paraphernalia. I was now 9 years old. All this paraphernalia, my father couldn't stand looking at it and built a fire and burned it all. In retrospect, he shouldn't have, but he was so beyond he was, he was crazed by all his losses. And every day you went to look, the Red Cross put up lists, and they put up lists of people who had survived, and none of them were ever on that list. I have tracing papers, and I know that most of them were killed and gassed in a camp called Sobibor in Poland, which was like Auschwitz. In Auschwitz you got the number, but just because you don't have a number doesn't mean that you didn't suffer. It just happened where you ended up. And so they took the children, like myself, and they started a school, and we were of all different ages, because none of us had education. None of us knew anything. The children who came out of hiding, hidden children, and camp survivors, and we were all put in this place, and they brought us up to snuff educationally. And when they thought we knew everything, or knew enough, we were distributed to the regular grammar schools or high schools in Amsterdam. And it was going all right. I had caught up, my mother got me a tutor. And I have to tell you something else. They came to the store, the Jewish people, because they wanted to start another Jewish school. Like you are in a Catholic school, a parochial school, and they wanted to start a Jewish parochial school. And my mother said, absolutely not. Because, when you come from a situation, as we did, you don't want to be all together, you're afraid. You're afraid. She said she'll have her Jewish education, but not all together in a school. And so anyway, life went on, and my aunts and uncles came back, and they decided in 1947 to go to America. They wanted to emigrate to America, although life was good for them. They had stores, but they wanted to go to the United States. And then in 1950-51, the Russians and the Koreans were carrying on, and my aunts kept telegramming my mother, and phoning, you gotta come here, you don't want to go for another world war, because my mom was in World War I in London. They were in the shelters and everything. And now she was in camps during World War II, and they said, you don't want to try for 3. So, and I didn't really want to leave Holland. I was in high school, I was getting a great education, and I didn't have too many friends because not everybody wanted to befriend a Jewish person. And, but we had a nice family life. But you had to do what your parents decide to do. So in 1951, we came to the United States as immigrants, not as refugees, and with my grandparents. And we came to Chicago because my aunts and uncles were in Chicago. And we lived on the south side of Chicago. I went to Hyde Park High School. And in Hyde Park, I try to adjust, but also in those days, maybe it's hard for you guys to imagine this, but there were not too many foreigners or people from different countries in the schools at that time. And the kids looked at me like I was an alien, like I was something strange. And I didn't quite understand all the English because I could speak a little English, but I couldn't speak American English, so I didn't quite understand everything. And it was very difficult. I was 15 years old at that point, and I don't know how old you guys are, but 15 years old to come to a new country and to learn a new life and a new social culture it's not easy. But they say if whatever doesn't make, you got to be strong. So I was strong. And so I adjusted, and I graduated Hyde Park. And before graduation, I met a young man, and we started to go out. And in 1955, we got married, and we have 3 children, 6 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And aren't I lucky? I am one of the lucky people. It's, it's good to be smart, but it's a lot better to be lucky, because I was very fortunate. There are a lot more stories that I have, but I don't think I'll have time to tell you all the stories of things that happened along the way. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. I am very happy to be here today, by the way, and I am thrilled that the Cubs won last night. I know we were all up, and my husband was so happy. He was sitting with his cap, and it was wonderful. So anyway, that's a good thing. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I don't know, Mr. Schuster, how much time I have?
We've got about 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. If there are no, yes, go ahead.
How did you adjust to the new lifestyle in America when you came?
Well, you know what? As I said, I was very close with my family, and we didn't have too many people on the so-called outside, and we all supported each other. And also, by the way, we did not speak about the Holocaust in those days. It was just not something you spoke about outside of the house, because I think we kind of felt it wasn't appropriate and people didn't understand it. Because at one point, and I'll get back to your answer in a minute, to your question in a minute. My grandfather went downstairs. We lived in Chicago, in the alley, and he went to bring the garbage down, and the neighbor said to him, "So, I haven't seen you around. Where are you from?" And my grandfather spoke English because he had lived in England, And he said, "Oh, well, we're from Holland, and, we went through the Holocaust, and it wasn't easy, but we came here, and we're happy to be here." And she says, "It was terrible here, too. We couldn't even get nylon stockings." And that for sure made us understand that people did not understand what went on and were not aware of what went on in Europe at the time. You are learning about this, but most people did not know, only what they read in the paper. It's like, do we know exactly what's going on in Syria and stuff like that? Do we know how these people are suffering? It's very similar to that, I think. So how I adjusted is by going to school and trying to belong, which I didn't. And I was only in the high school for 2 years until I graduated. I really had enough credits to go to college, but in those days, at 15, 16, you could not go to college. You were too young. Couldn't happen today either. But I passed the entrance exam to go to University of Illinois. And when they found out my age, they said, "Sorry." So I had to just bear up. And then, as I said, I met my future husband, and my family worked. My mother had a job the second day she was here. She spoke English because she was born in England. She spoke Dutch, of course, as well. And they all worked. My father got a job. He went to night school to learn English, and we all fended for ourselves. We didn't go to any agencies. We just worked hard, and they succeeded. They all lived a nice life. My mom, I was lucky to have my mom till she was 104. But I mean, the American culture was so different for me because people were so casual with their teachers and stuff like that, and we used to like be afraid of our teachers and have to really toe the mark. Toe the mark, is it called? You really had to be polite and it was no casual. This wasn't casual at all, the relationship. So this was totally different. But you learn. Yes, ma'am.
How did you keep hope while you were in prison?
I'm sorry, you have to speak a little louder.
How did you keep hope while you were
How did I?
Keep hope.
You know, that's a very good question. Um, I went to a program at the museum. I speak at the Illinois Holocaust Museum in Skokie, which I would love for you all to come and visit one day. It's really fascinating. But and it was we have a program, Danny knows, but it was about a photographer who shot pictures of people in Amsterdam. So I went to it, and the photographer was German, and her husband was German, but her husband, and they fled to the Netherlands, and her husband in 1940, he was Jewish, and he committed suicide, and it was it was kind of, oh my Lord, why did he do that? You know, you can't give up hope because you cannot survive without hope. You don't think that the worst is going to happen. You know, I mean, like these people, they took these people, droves and hundreds and thousands of people on these cattle cars. And I was looking online the other day at pictures, and the people had smiles on their faces because they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know that it was the end of their lives in a few days when they got off these trains. And so they were hoping that, okay, so they would only go to a labor camp and everything would be all right. Did they know that their children would be killed first thing out? So you have to, as a matter, you know, not knowing also helped keeping hope. You really, you know, ignorance is bliss. And maybe they did us a favor by not telling people what happened. You know, in retrospect, well, maybe, you know. Yes.
Have you forgiven the Nazi soldiers that imprisoned you? And
I'm
also,
sorry, I have trouble hearing something.
have you forgiven the Nazi soldiers?
Uh, well, okay, that's a very complicated question. Forgiving is a big thing. First of all, forgetting is out of the question totally. But forgiving, you know, the soldiers were only doing what they were told to do. They were only doing, it was brutal. And there might have been some that weren't as bad as others. Maybe they helped some of the prisoners a little bit, you know? But they were told what to do. They had nothing. They had nothing to lose. So they said, we'll do whatever you tell us to do. You know, we'll kill these people. They're only Jews. What are Jews? Worms, inhuman. That was the whole thing. See, the thing they made them shoot the Jews or kill the Jews is because you know, their doctrine was that Jews were lower than people. They were not people. So their mental attitude was different. And I wouldn't say that all these soldiers were totally smart. They were not educated, they were not smart, and they were very young. And will I forgive them? It's not up to me to forgive them, you know? But I must say that we have volunteers at the museum, young men. They come between graduating high school and going to college. And it's a volunteer program. And they come and work as interns at our museum. And they are wonderful young men. And I'm very friendly with one of them who went back to Germany now and lives in Berlin, has a child and a wife and child. And he is the best thing ever. I mean, he loves everybody. He's intelligent, he's educated, you know. So this nowadays, I have hope again that this is a new generation and maybe a better generation, you know, and they still have to suffer for what happens to us because people all look at them like, oh, they're Germans, you know, and look at what they did. But these people didn't do it. Like you didn't do whatever, if your great grandfather or grandfather had done. I'm not saying he did, but you know, had been evil, you know. So it you know, it never stops. This Holocaust is not just from 40 to 45 or from 33 to 45. It goes on and on and on. And these people, these young interns, I find them to be upstanders. And we try to tell people not to be bystanders. When stuff happens, you know, there were people that were into resistance and people that hid people, uh, and they were upstanders. They took their own lives in their hands. They had, if they were caught, not only they would get killed, besides the Jews being killed, but their whole families would get killed. And so they were taking an awful big chance. I mean, just think of yourself. Would you do that? Would you take somebody in and the off chance that you might get caught and your whole family, your mom, your dad, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, everybody gets imprisoned and killed? This was very courageous. So those are upstanders. And unfortunately, we should have had more. But we're thankful for the ones we had. You know, they're the righteous people that did this. But, and you know, my feeling is that personally, that I'm, as I said, a very lucky person. I had my parents with me, so I wasn't as disengaged as some people who had no parents with them, who has really suffered more, because if you have your parents with you, they protect you and you really don't totally know what was going on. You know, I was so lucky in that situation. And, you know, I have a friend and her sister whose parents they were in hiding, and their parents were in hiding, and where the parents were hid, the girl started dating a German soldier, and she maybe purposely or not betrayed them, or told them that there were Jews in the house, and they were killed. And these ladies are my age, and they came back without their parents, and they suffer to this day, every day. You know, their children have no grandparents, no family, and they weren't raised by their parents. And not being raised by your parents is really sad. I just can show you, um, this is the picture. This is in La Bourboule. It's in the Dordogne area. There's a river down the street, and that's me. And this was a parade on VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day. We were still in France. And this is a very proud possession of mine. It's my naturalization paper. I was naturalized in 1956, and my husband couldn't even be a witness. I was married already, but he couldn't be my witness because he didn't know me long enough. I had to get a friend who I went to school with, to be my witness. I took the thing. You know, it's wonderful. And this is not a new picture, but it is a picture of my family. The two little ones on the down below are now 17 and 18, and at GBN, Johnbrook North. And the lady in the light blue suit is my mother, and the lady behind her is my daughter, and the one to the right of her is my son, and then the other one next to my husband is my daughter, and myself and my grandchildren. So how lucky am I to have a whole family with children, grandchildren, you know? The one at the very end, the young man at the right, is my oldest grandchild, who is now a daddy, and he's gonna be 30, and he made us great grandparents. So, you know, I'm so glad that, and do I have, you know, sometimes the question is, do you have any, did it affect your life? Did this Holocaust affect my life? Well, it did affect my life in the fact that I was never young. I never had a youth. I never went with girlfriends and played at birthday parties. The last good birthday party I had was when I was 5, when my whole family, including my dad's side, came to our house for my 5th birthday. That was a big thing, and my mother had saved her ration coupons and had made pastries, and everybody was there. And I really don't enjoy celebrating birthdays because of that. I guess it's an after effect. But it was a wonderful birthday. And unfortunately, things like that, whoops. So this is the interment. This was to go to Vitel. This is a drawing of what the barracks looks like. Because we as children didn't work. We played in the dirt. It was all sand and dirt there. And there was only one bathroom at the end of the barrack with only cold water, and it looked like a trough, like what they use on farms, is a trough with cold water and one toilet. Then they had what they call public toilets that was plywood with holes in them. And this is not very nice to talk about, but people had to go there, and then the prisoners had to go down there and clean it up. Not wonderful. But you see, look at the people were going on some of the trains, they were being transported, but they didn't look worried because they didn't know. And this was when they left us, after the guy let us go, he took our name off the list. This was 1942, and we had to have a pass to get out. And we had to present ourselves to this Jüdische Auswanderung and at the address, and you had to let them see that you were allowed. See, it says on the bottom there that you're allowed to stay with this thing after 8 o'clock on the street. Nach 20 Uhr, 20 is 8 o'clock, that you could be on the street, otherwise you would be arrested again for being out after curfew. That was the Jewish store. And this was one of our stores. And the first gentleman on the left is my grandfather. And then the man with the hand up is my dad. The other gentleman worked for us. And you can see all this stuff. That was only one side of the store with all the merchandise they had. This was in 1941. It was the wedding of my father's youngest brother, who was on the right side in the middle with the little flower in his lapel. I'm the one way at the end with the big bow. And of all the people there, only 4 people survived. Of all those people there, shortly thereafter, they were all killed, and this couple had a baby, and I saw in the tracing papers that they killed him at 2 years old. And this was my mother's youngest sister's wedding. That's the one who's now 97, and her husband was killed in Mauthausen after they were married 6 months. And I'm the one with the pointed hat in the front, because in Holland they celebrated weddings that way.
Before you leave for lunch, Ms. Glass has made a comment about how incredibly lucky she was. And I guess I want to comment on how incredibly lucky we are to have been able to hear this story and share this time with her, and how appreciative we are.
Thank you. I just want to show you, I brought this. This is from the 1940s. It's made by Philips, because we were not allowed to walk out and there were no lights on the street, and the windows had to be blacked out and stuff like that. So this was our flashlight. It never dies. I gave one to the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and this one belonged to one of my uncles. And that's what we had to use. So my husband said, well, it didn't give much light. I said, well, better than nothing. But I thank you all for your attention.